All right, today's training is going to go over Respondus Lockdown Browser and using it with Canvas to administer both classic and new quizzes at UCSB. Today's training will go over first what is Respondus. So we'll talk about some of its features, why you might consider using it. We'll then go into configuring it, so how you would go about turning it on in your Canvas course. We'll then demo the student experience, so what a student would see on their side when they access Lockdown Browser to then take a quiz in Canvas. And we'll finish by go over some best practices and considerations if you do want to implement Respondus Lockdown Browser, some things to think about, and how you can get additional help and resources following today's training. So with that, touch on what Respondus is. So Respondus is a separate web browser. Typically, popular web browsers are Internet Explorer, Safari, Chrome, Firefox, all used to browse the internet. Respondus Lockdown Browser is its own separate web browser. The thing that sets it apart is that it secures and prevents students from doing anything else other than taking a quiz while accessing the quiz through the browser. So you can require that a quiz use the Respondus Lockdown Browser, and when a student goes into the browser, starts taking the quiz, they can't do anything else while they're taking that quiz. So it prevents them from doing things like printing. They won't be able to print from the browser. They can't copy and paste text or anything else in the browser. They can't go outside of the browser itself, so they're locked into the window that the browser uses. It takes up the whole screen, and they can't access any other application. So any other software, other programs on their computer, all of those things will be inaccessible while they're using Respondus and taking that quiz. Samantha will touch on that when we get to our demo. And it's compatible with both Windows machines, Apple machines using Mac machines, Chromebooks. There's an extension that students can download to use Respondus in a Chromebook. And then students can also use it on an iPad. One significant caveat: if a student uses Respondus, wants to use Respondus on an iPad, they can't have the Canvas student app on that iPad. So they would need to uninstall, remove the Canvas student app on their iPad, and then access Respondus Lockdown Browser on the iPad. So little caveat with that. So some considerations are some things, some features about Respondus, what it does, why you might consider using it. And Samantha's going to get into actually turning it on from an instructor perspective.
Yeah. So Respondus Lockdown Browser, as Gus mentioned, is used in conjunction with Canvas quizzes. So these can be classic quizzes or new quizzes, and I'll talk through the configuration of those quizzes in your Canvas course now. So to do that, you would first navigate to your Canvas course. I'm here in my basic sandbox site, so that's the course I'll be using here today. And the first thing to do is enable Lockdown Browser in this course. To do that, I'll scroll down to the Settings tab on the left course navigation menu, and I'll click Navigation here in the center. This will give me a list of all of the enabled items in my course at the top, and down at the bottom are all of the items that are disabled in my course. Here's where you'll find things like GauchoCast, Zoom, Poll Everywhere, things that you can enable in your specific course. So you'll look down this list and find Lockdown Browser. Click on the triple dots to the right-hand side and click Enable. That'll move it to the top section in the list of enabled tools. And I'll just want to make sure I scroll down to the bottom and click Save to add Lockdown Browser to my course navigation menu. So I'll see here I now have Lockdown Browser in my course navigation menu. I can click on that and it'll open up my Lockdown browser dashboard. And this will list out all of my quizzes in the course. So all of my classic and or new quizzes in the course. To enable requiring Lockdown browser for a specific exam, I'll click this down arrow to the left-hand side of that exam. So for example, if I wanted to require Lockdown browser for the final exam, I'll click this down arrow, click Settings, and then choose the setting to require Lockdown browser for this exam. I'll then click Save and Close, and I'll see that my final exam now has Lockdown browser required. It also changes the quiz name. You'll see it adds this requires Respondus lockdown browser as both an indicator to you and to your students that, in order to take this quiz, you're going to have to use the Respondus lockdown browser. There are some additional settings that you can configure in Respondus lockdown browser. So if I click on that same kind of caret icon to the left-hand side and click Settings, you'll see some settings here. So the first one is a password setting. This is a password that you can require students to type in before they can access the exam. This might be something that you're going to give to them verbally in person. You're going to write it up on the board, and essentially before they can access the quiz, they have to enter in that password. Generally, we recommend, Canvas quizzes also have an access code feature, and so we recommend setting it up on the Canvas side rather than requiring it here in Lockdown browser. But if you're going to put it in both places, just make sure that they match exactly. So things like capitalization, punctuation, spelling should match between, Lockdown browser and Canvas settings. But in general, we find that just setting it in the Canvas setting is sufficient. There are also some advanced settings here that you can configure for each quiz. The first is to require Lockdown browser to view post-exam feedback and results. This is what happens when students finish taking their exam, the day after, 2 days down the road, kind of when they want to go back and see what their score was, which questions did they get right, which questions did they get wrong. If you want them to have to use Lockdown browser to view those results, or if they can just use their standard web browser. The second setting here is to lock students into the browser until the exam is completed. Generally, we don't recommend checking this option because when a student exits out of Lockdown browser prior to submitting their quiz, it'll actually prompt them to say why they are leaving the quiz. And it generally tends to be for troubleshooting issues. Their computer is frozen, Lockdown browser is not working right. They're trying to maybe restart their computer and then go back and access the quiz. And if you have this setting checked, they won't be able to do that. Essentially, they won't be able to complete any troubleshooting steps without closing out, without submitting their exam. Then you have to go in, provide them extra attempts, etc. So in general, we just recommend leaving this setting unchecked. You'll be able to monitor any early exits. You'll be able to see why students left, when they left their exam. But it can allow for students to maybe change computers if they need to, restart their computer, and still be able to successfully complete the exam. The next setting here is to allow access to specific external web browsers. This is useful if you want to allow students to access specific websites or an ebook. Remember, as Gus mentioned, Lockdown browser doesn't allow them any other, websites. And so if there are specific websites that you want students to be able to access, you need to specify them in the settings or else students won't be able to, navigate to them while in Lockdown browser. And then you can also enable a calculator on the toolbar or enable printing on the toolbar. So just again, depending on your quiz or exam, you can decide what you want to make available to students and what you don't. Once you're done choosing the settings, you'll go ahead and click Save and Close. And that's really it from the instructor's point of view. So you enable lockdown browser in the course and then choose the quizzes that you want to require it for in the lockdown browser dashboard. The next thing I'll talk about is what a lockdown browser looks like from the student's experience. And so it really starts with kind of the student workflow. So the first thing that students need to do is download Lockdown Browser from a UCSB specific link. And it's best to do this before exam day. You don't want them having to come to their exam and kind of try to troubleshoot these things in real time. Have them download it beforehand. So you'd be providing them the link, you'd be communicating it to them ahead of time. And so that would allow students to download it onto their computer. On the day of the exam, students should close out and quit all other programs on their computers. One of the things Lockdown Browser does is it doesn't allow things like Zoom or iMessages or Grammarly to be working. And so we find that really it works best if students just proactively kind of quit out of everything that they have running on their computer. Close out iMessages, shut down any screen sharing tools, kind of just shut everything down and start from scratch. And then the students will go ahead and take the quiz. This looks different for if you're using a classic quiz in Canvas or a new quiz in Canvas. I'll share a screen recording in the next slide about each. But essentially, in classic, you'll launch Lockdown Browser, navigate to the exam, and take it. And if you take using Canvas new quizzes, you'll launch the exam first, and that'll actually force open Lockdown Browser on your computer. So with this workflow, I'll go ahead and show what it looks like kind of launching Lockdown Browser. And we'll start first with what it looks like from a classic quiz. So here is a screen recording, and the first thing I am doing is launching Lockdown Browser. So you can see here, I am opening up the Lockdown Browser application on my computer. It is going to, load Lockdown Browser, and it's going to take me directly to UCSB's Canvas page. I'll click the UCSB Users button, and I'm taken to this familiar single sign-on screen where I'll enter in my net ID and my password. So you want to make sure that students don't have their password just auto-saved. They need to know what their password is to type it into this specific browser. If they have it saved on Chrome, that won't populate over into Lockdown Browser. Once I click Submit, it'll ask me to duo. And so I'll need my phone nearby to be able to duo in and say, hey, this is me accessing my UCSB account on Respondus Lockdown Browser. Once I've entered into my Canvas account, it'll go ahead and take me to my Canvas dashboard, just like normal. And I'll go ahead and navigate to my course and navigate to the quiz that I want to take. It's best to navigate to it from the quizzes tab, from the assignments tab, and not directly from the dashboard. Here, I'll go ahead and I'll start take the quiz, and you'll notice it opens it up in Respondus, and students can then take the quiz. They don't have any other things that they can access. They can't open up other tabs. I'm just clicking up here at the top to show you, they can have accent items, but they don't have like a web browser to do. And if they want to close the exam before completing it, they're asked to provide that reason, and they can type that in, and you as the instructor have access to these reasons here, and then they can close out. So that's what it looks like for Canvas Classic quizzes. So they're going to load Lockdown Browser, navigate to Canvas, log into Canvas, navigate to the quiz, and take the quiz. For new quizzes, it's a slightly different workflow. Here you can actually start logged into Canvas. So I'm on this Canvas quiz here. I can navigate to it. And once I click on the quiz, it'll actually launch Lockdown Browser that I already have installed on my computer. So here it is, launching my quiz in Lockdown browser. I forgot to close out of a few programs here on my computer, and so Lockdown Browser will actually tell me that I have to close those applications in order to continue on in the quiz. So I force closed those applications to get moving onto the quiz. And then the quiz itself will load. Any instructions you've provided will be prompted here, and I can begin the assessment. And then this is that same assessment, just in a Canvas new quiz. Students can complete the quiz and submit their exam. So this quiz will open up in Respondus Lockdown browser. Again, they can't print, they can't copy and paste text, they can't access other items until they've submitted their exam, and then they can quit and close out Respondus. So that's really the workflow there for new quizzes. And so that's kind of the student experience. That's what it looks like from the student's perspective. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Gus, who will talk about best practices, help and support with Respondus.
All right, so some things to keep in mind and just some best practices when you're thinking about implementing Respondus in your course. This is ideally used in a proctored setting. So we recommend that if you're going to implement this in their course, that this is done in an in-class environment where students are bringing a laptop smart device that has this preloaded on their device for an exam in class. If it's used in a remote setting where students are taking this at home, wherever, outside of class, students can access another device. They won't be able to copy and paste from another device, but they just will have access to potentially outside resources that Respondus can't be held accountable for. Another recommendation, a huge one that we recommend, is utilizing a practice quiz test in your course before you actually have the high stakes, exam, test, quiz, what have you, that students are going to be, assessed on. This gives students a chance to download Respondus if they haven't used it before. Then they can take that quiz, make sure they understand what they need to do on their computer, what changes they need to make sure they've downloaded it, all that, just to mitigate the potential for student issues on the actual exam day where you're utilizing Respondus. And to that point, just notifying students and repeating that notification, letting students know you have, ideally you have this practiced quiz where we're going to use Respondus, and then, letting them know again, we're going to have this Respondus in use for our actual exam on this date, just always repeating those instructions and letting them know that this is going to be used for their exam. And then directing students to Respondus for assistance. In a minute here, I'll show you how you can get additional instructor-facing information, and then also how students can get support from Respondus if they're having any issues with the software. And then, when you're thinking about the actual logistics, nuts and bolts of the exam, just having a backup plan for students. So we know that when you introduce technology, there's just so many variables that come with it that you may need to have a backup plan for students who, their device doesn't work, it's not charged, something happens, that they're not able to use Respondus and take the exam as planned. So, maybe that's printing out the exam so you have paper copies that, for those students that their issue comes up, you have an alternative, outside of the online exam, you have a paper exam for them to take. And then one other thing, attendance. If you're worried that you're, having a proctored exam or students are using Respondus, but you think there may be some reason that a student is taking it outside of that proctored environment, you may want to institute some sort of attendance check, whether it's checking IDs, a sign-in sheet, something with your TAs, just to account for who was there, who was present in your exam physically, just so you can account for who is there. We won't be able to assess, if a student was present in your course on exam day or anything like that. So to finish up, I'll just touch on again how you can get some other support, or if you need more information that's not involved or not covered in today's training. Back in that lockdown browser dashboard that once you add it to your course here, you'll have some tabs up in the top right. Getting started, this goes over a lot of what we touched on today. Then you have video tutorials to go over other Respondus features, and then guides and support, student instructions that you can pass on to students. And then on the student side, in Canvas, this is a student-facing link. When students click help, they'll see an option for lockdown browser help. And if they click that, this actually goes to Respondus and it lets them create a ticket with Respondus. So if they have any issues, downloading, installing Respondus, they can submit a ticket. Respondus can help them, and figure out what's going on and help them get it downloaded to their device. I'll just highlight as well, you can get help as an instructor. If you click help here, if you click UCSB Canvas support, that will come to our team that supports Canvas at UCSB. We can work with you on Canvas or Respondus to try and troubleshoot any issues you might be having. And in the description of this training, we'll also have our links that are both the student-facing guide for Respondus at UCSB and then the instructor-facing guide for Respondus. So thank you for watching and good luck.